It's the week ending Saturday, the 10th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Haiti in turmoil after the assassination of President Moise in his home, Andy Jassy taking over from Jeff Bezos as CEO of Amazon, and England reaching the final of the UEFA European Championships for the first time in history. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kate Samuelson and Sorcha Bradley, and from the Week magazine, editor Theo Tait, a man notable for his understatement. But Theo, did you allow yourself a suppressed shriek of joy on Wednesday night?
I did. It wasn't very...
And we can all feel you're reliving that moment right now. Guys, Theo's coming home, everybody.
It said, remember where you were, remember what's happening. I looked around in my sitting room and I had my dad and my son, and they were all sort of staring at the screen, not looking that excited. But, it was good. It was good, but we didn't go wild.
An injection of harsh realism into the tabloid rhetoric there. That's what we love you for. Kate, you are starting us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Swimming caps taking centre stage of Olympic discourse.
We think about FINA as an international organisation. At the highest level, we're hearing that we want the sport to be inclusive and representative. We want to have people of colour in the sport, but we want them to join on our terms. And that really is not what inclusion is about. Hair is a significant barrier to aquatics for many women, especially many people of colour.
Danielle Obey there, a founding member of the Black Swimming Association, speaking to Sky Sports last week. Kate, what's the story?
Swimming caps that are designed for natural black hair will not be allowed at the Olympics after they were rejected by the International Swimming Federation, which is known as FINA, and that's the governing body for swimming. And they described the caps as not fitting the natural form of the head. And the statement added that elite athletes have never used, neither required to use, caps of such size, concluding that the cap wasn't suitable for big international competitions like the Tokyo Olympics.
OK, and I think we can probably guess if we haven't seen, but do outline for us, what has the reaction to this statement been?
As you can imagine, the news has not gone down well. People have described the claims that the caps don't fit the natural form of the head as racist. And the cap in question is actually called Soul Cap, which is a black-owned brand, and they are designed to specifically fit over dreadlocks, afros, weaves, braids, and thick curly hair. They've said that the caps don't give swimmers an unfair advantage. They merely fit natural black hair in a way that ordinary swim caps don't.
Theo, let's be charitable, though, and say that the intention of this ruling was not the othering of black athletes just before the Olympics. Let's say that FINA were worried about something to do with this piece of kit, this swimming cap. What do you think they were worried about?
I find it very hard to tell since, it is well known that there's a problem with inclusion with black people in swimming, and it's well known that hair is a big part of that. And then you think, well, why would they put out this particularly harsh? And, if people want to wear large caps, presumably it makes them actually slower and puts them at a disadvantage. I mean, it just doesn't seem like the kind of thing that you would want anyone to take a judgment on. So I really have no idea.
OK, because I was wondering whether it was something to do with streamlining, because Sorcha, this isn't the first sort of swimming accessory that's been banned by FINA, is it? There was a controversy about 10 years ago regarding swimming suits.
Yeah, so in 2010, polyurethane and neoprene swimsuits were actually banned from the competition. The suits cut down on fatigue and gave swimmers more buoyancy, and a lot of world records were broken. So it gave swimmers a significant advantage. So I think in that case, it made sense to take away the swimming suits because at the end of the day, it's supposed to be on pure swimming ability, not what fancy gear you have to help you along. But I agree with Theo. I kind of struggle to see what advantage could be gained from having a properly fitting swimming cap.
I suppose, though, there is an argument that if you've trained to be an elite athlete, Theo, whatever colour you are, and you've put in all of that mileage, all of those hours, you've dedicated your life to it, is it really that big a deal at that level? I understand the argument, of course, about entry-level swimming and getting people involved from diverse backgrounds. But at the highest rank, is it really that big deal to shave your head to go swimming at the Olympics? And then everyone's on an equal playing field?
Well, I don't think people should be forced to shave their heads before they can enter the swimming pool. I mean, I think, it seems like the UK swimming bodies that are not raising any objections to these caps, which is great. And probably it's more of a grassroots issue than, than the people at the very top. But, symbolically, it looks terrible, doesn't it?
Well, let's talk about that, Sorcha, because people have talked about the kind of economic privilege of swimming as a sport because it's one of the best funded Olympic categories there is. And this issue does extend into the wider population when it comes to who is actually getting access to pools.
Yeah, absolutely. I think swimming pools have kind of been seen as elitist spaces for a very long time. I mean, if you think of swimming pools, you kind of think of private members clubs or even the Sky Pool in London, if we've all seen that in the news. And then obviously in the States, there's actually a long history of segregation to contend with. This all kind of contributes to a culture where Black and ethnic minorities don't see swimming pools as safe and welcoming spaces. That definitely trickles down into the competitive world of swimming. So the BBC actually sent a Freedom of Information request to Swim England. And out of 73,000 competitive swimmers who are registered with them, only 668 identify as Black or mixed race. So there's clearly a massive problem. We're not getting Black or mixed race swimmers into swimming pools, into competitive level sport. And as you say, it's one of the best funded sports. Much more could be done to get entry-level schemes. Football, I think, is a good comparison. There's lots of young Black players who come up through these schemes. I think we should see that in swimming and other elite sports as well.
Except, Kate, we are seeing Black representation on Team GB this year, aren't we? Alice Dearing is representing us as the, albeit third Black swimmer in history to have ever represented Britain at an Olympic level. What's she had to say about this?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is shocking when you think about the lack of diversity in the sport. And as you said, Alice is the third Black swimmer in GB history and the first Black female swimmer. And she's actually partnered with Soul Cap, the swimming cap in question. The fact that she's got this strong connection to the swimming cap, the fact that she's a pioneering figure in the sports world at the moment shows just how illy thought through the decision was by FINA to ban the caps in the first place. And she's spoken out and said that she's worried about what this decision looks like to young Black female swimmers. Will it discourage them from taking part in the sport? Will it make them feel like swimming is even more exclusive than before?
You do wonder, Theo, though, if you follow the money here, because the Olympics, to a large extent, is about a lot of money. You could argue it's only happening in Japan in 2021 because the American networks need to broadcast it, having put so much money into it, that if Soul Cap was, owned by Speedo, this conversation wouldn't be happening. They're a Black British startup, and that puts them in a different category, perhaps, to some of the big brands whose sportswear gets worn on the track and field and in the pool.
Yeah, I think this is probably a story about international sports bodies, which I think we probably know by now are fairly sinister mercenary organisations, to make a massive generalisation. But, we've seen the IOC and FIFA, and it is all about following the money. They do tend to make very strange decisions which don't seem to be about what you'd hope they'd be about, which is about, stimulating the sports at the basic level.
Do you think this conversation's cut through, though, Sorcha? I mean, we're flagging it up as a slightly underreported story. Do you think the Olympic commentators are going to mention it when Alice Dearing gets in the pool?
I hope so, because it's good to see people who aren't well represented in top level sports get to that top level. And I think we want to see more Black, Asian, ethnic minority people get to that top level as well. If there's easy ways to make people feel more included and essentially be able to compete at their best, as every person should get the opportunity to, that should happen. And hopefully, it is picked up by sports commentators, and hopefully people do consider it as something worth thinking about.
I do wonder as well, Kate, whether the underrepresentation of Black swimmers isn't entirely due to the privileged organisations not representing them or not including them, and whether there's an element of, people from their own communities growing up being told it's not really for you, Black people don't really swim. I mean, this is something that you hear a lot from Black swimmers when they're interviewed, saying, I was brought up believing that swimming wasn't really just for me. And that's something that probably has to come from Black communities as well. Is that something that it is something you should aspire to do? It's not just, something for white people.
As Sorcha mentioned earlier, a factor probably does come back to the era of segregation in the US, where Black people weren't allowed access to swimming pools. And on the rare occasions that they were, they felt unsafe and neglected. So I think definitely it needs to come from all sides. But I think efforts like Soul Cap and the cap that they've created do go a long way to make the sport more accessible. I think they've sold something like 30,000 caps around the world. So there's definitely a demand for it. People want this product.
So, Kate, you chose this as your story of the week. What do you think is going to happen next? How do you think it will resolve?
So we'll have to wait and see. There's about 3 weeks left until the Olympics, and there's still time for FINA to reverse the decision. They've actually put out a statement after all the public pressure that was on them. They've put out a statement saying that they're reviewing the situation.
They don't have long.
They don't have long, but they have said that they understand the importance of inclusivity and representation. And it's also worth noting that obviously the decision has been really upsetting, especially for Black swimmers. But even the founders of Soul Cap have said actually it's opened up a dialogue. They don't see it as a setback. In fact, it's been a good opportunity to raise awareness about this issue in the sport.
Yeah, well, they're probably going to be expecting an acquisition from Speedo soon. Theo, we'll be coming to you next after this. OK, Theo, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The world took another baby step towards the 4-day week.
Will, I'm guessing that it wasn't very hard to find people to be part of your study. How happy were Icelanders to be taking part?
Well, this is a remarkable study in many ways because it went on for 4 years, unbeknownst to many people internationally. But the results are hugely positive. Workers from all sorts of areas of the public sector incredibly happy with their work-life balance, spending more time with their families, doing more kind of extra curricular activities, things like cycling, taking up new hobbies and so on. So it's been an overwhelming success, as you might imagine, from the workers' perspective, but also one from the employers too.
Will Strong, co-director of the UK work innovation think tank Autonomy. You can hear the full discussion on the As It Happens podcast from CBC Radio. Theo, what's the story?
So this is a report that's come out about the world's largest ever trial of a shorter working week. And about 2,500 workers in Iceland took part in a programme which reduced the working week from about 40 hours to about 35 hours. And they didn't actually lose any pay either. And the results were great. They said that productivity and service provision remained the same or improved across the majority of trial workplaces, and that well-being dramatically increased across a range of indicators from stress and burnout to health, work-life balance, and also that it was cost neutral for the two bodies that took part in it, which was Reykjavik Council and the Icelandic State. OK, the well-being part of the piece is perhaps not a surprise. The productivity piece, does that require a bit more examination? I mean, what were the jobs that people were doing in this trial? I mean, it's a bit easier, isn't it, for kind of professional or white-collar jobs than it is if you're in manufacturing. Can you really make as much stuff in 1 day less per week than you could with 5? Yeah, and this is the main objection that the people who like the 4-day week say, you know, it increases productivity, and people who are against it say, well, you'd really have to increase productivity a lot to make it cost neutral. How on earth are you going to make up that extra day? I suppose the sort of exciting thing about this trial is that it was all public sector jobs, so there's that to consider, but it was across a whole range of places, schools, hospitals, basically places where they do shift work, which is one of the main areas where, you know, as you say, like me, I'm an office worker. If I was less tired and stressed, then I could probably do my job a bit faster. But if you're a nurse, you basically got to put in the hours and be on the ward. So, you know, that makes it more difficult. But in this case, you know, they're pretty positive about it, and they have now apparently reorganised lots of their contracts to put people on these things long term. Kate, the future's bright for the 4-day week. It's coming around the corner. We're all going to be doing it in 2 years' time. What do you think?
I would absolutely love that, to be honest. I actually worked a 4-day week in my last job. I had the option to compress my hours. And to be honest, it was amazing. I felt like I got the same amount of work done as I was doing on the 5-day week in a shorter week. I was working slightly longer hours, but, you know, often you'll work a bit longer during the week anyway. I just felt like I was using my time more productively. I wasn't wasting time so much. Knowing that I had this whole full day on Fridays to do what I wanted really motivated me to just get my work done. So yeah, I'm all for it.
OK, I'm going to try my facetious question again to Sorcha then, because obviously Kate's on board. I mean, obviously the pandemic has helped, hasn't it, bring this idea out of the political wilderness, but it is still seen as a radical idea, really, isn't it, in Britain at least?
Yeah, I think the Labour Party tried to introduce it as a policy a few years ago, and there was lots of pushback against that. And it was seen as an unrealistic utopian pipe dream. But I also used to have a 4-day week. So I can tell you it is great. And hopefully Theo will tell you that my productivity was 10 out of 10. After the pandemic, though, attitudes to work are changing. Ideas about what's really important has changed as well. There is beginning to be that mental shift in the public's mind about what could constitute a traditional working week.
And we've seen some big names, haven't we, in America, for example, actually getting on board with the 4-day week.
Yeah, Unilever adopted a 4-day week last year as the pandemic hit, and they actually gave their staff a chance to slash their hours by 20% without hurting their pay. So they're still getting paid the same. And that was because essentially they thought that the old ways of working were outdated. They wanted to measure performance on output, not time.
Yeah, and we've seen Kickstarter and Slack and others moving to the 4-day week too. But it seems to me, Theo, that there's kind of two trends going on at once here. Yes, actually, in the world's richest economies, if you zoom out far enough, full-time workers now put in on average between 20 and 30 hours less time each week than they did 150 years ago. The trend has always been towards more leisure time, less work time, and that's continuing. But at the same time, I guess because of digital technology, really, working from home, we've touched on this before, you're expected to be always on. So it's one thing saying you work a 4-day week, but if your Slack and your WhatsApp are pinging all the time and you're expected to respond to deadlines in the middle of the night, then actually, in a way, you're sort of half working all the time.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of issues with all this is that in the old days, you could probably point to, those figures we have from the 19th century when what we're talking about was industrial workers and there were fairly fixed patterns. Whereas nowadays, the economy is so varied. You talk about, gig workers, for instance, 4-day week's not going to be very attractive to them, is it?
Yeah, and for many of those guys, that's their second job anyway.
Yeah, so that's going to be pretty complicated. And I think also it's quite interesting that what you've seen generally in the last, since sort of, say, 1930, is that the standard industrial workers, such as they exist nowadays, work much fewer hours. But actually the professionals, who I kind of think you're probably talking about when you talk about picking up messages, they tend to work much longer hours. So there's been a sort of crisscross going through along the way.
What about for younger people starting out in their careers, Kate? There's sometimes pressure on people to work at the weekends, as it is. It's a bit odd, isn't it? You've got this trend for the kind of more senior people in the organisation to take an extra day off, whereas the people who are trying to get a foothold and show how keen they are and offer up as much elbow grease as possible are being worked to the bone for less money.
I think one good thing to come out of the pandemic is that it's put an end, or at least put a slight end to presenteeism, the idea that you need to be sitting at your desk and that you need to kind of be visible to show that you're getting your work done. And I think for younger people, they can really prove themselves at work now by the quality of their work and the efficiency as opposed to the number of hours they put in. To me, it feels like quite an old-fashioned attitude that you need to work really long hours and you need to work on the weekend in order to get your job done well. I think that attitudes have changed, and I think that things have really moved on since then.
Well, from that point of view, have things actually sort of moved on, Sorcha, from the 4-day week already? Because if you're actually looking at the problems that need addressing, particularly for women with childcare issues, you might say it shouldn't be a 4-day week. It should just be flexible working. Like, you should have a set amount of hours and you should be able to say when you're going to be able to do those hours.
I do think maybe initiatives like a 4-day week or flexible working could help get people into the workforce that perhaps struggle to get into the workforce. As you say, mothers with children or any parents with childcare responsibilities, people who can't work full time for other reasons, maybe health reasons. But I think the problem with flexible working is, like we were kind of discussing, sometimes that ends up just stretching into working full time for less pay or working full time when you're not really supposed to be working. And so I think what a 4-day week could do is put that hard stop there for, okay, you're not going to work on this day. It's another weekend day. It's time for leisure, rest, relaxation.
Could it be quite disruptive for our culture, though, Theo? I mean, you're the editor of a magazine called The Week. It is based on the rhythm of, and I know that's based on how many times, the Earth goes around the sun, but it is based on the division of the weeks of the year. And the weekend, I suppose, is quite arbitrary in the sense that it's not based on the Earth going around the sun, but at the same time, our whole lives have been built on this idea. You have 5 weeks of work, you have 2 days of leisure. Do you think could really change the way people behave and the way they think about when they read a magazine like yours, when they go to work, when they take a day off, when they have a drink.
Well, what's really interesting to me is that, well, I mean, for first, that a month and a year have a basis in nature. A 7-day week doesn't. It's the Romans used to do 10 days. The revolutionary French did the same. I mean, actually, the 2-day weekend is a new thing. It only came about in the 1930s and the 1940s, and it was actually led by sort of a mixture of sort of enlightened employers like, Ford. And until then, people used to work Saturday morning, or, and that came about in the middle of the 19th century. So this is all very recent. It's all going very fast. But yes, to respond to the other part of it, equally, you need someone there watching things, and that is a real issue. If everyone was working 4-day weeks, I don't know how a magazine like mine would work. I mean, I could not possibly work a 4-day week. It just wouldn't work at all. And then there are whole bits of the economy where that's true. I think it's clear that the general trend is towards working fewer hours. In 1930-something, John Maynard Keynes wrote an essay saying he thought that by 2030, everyone would be working 15 hours a week because all of the hard work would be done by the machines and everyone would have been lifted above the level of basic want. Obviously, that hasn't happened, but we are moving slowly in that direction, I think.
Fascinating stuff. I should say, if you are interested in this subject, you should check out James Plunkett's new book, which is called End State, in which he argues for the 4-day week and other radical ideas. I mention it because the audiobook is read by a certain Olly Mann. So if you're interested in this subject and you like my voice, that is surely worth an Audible credit. Right, Sorcha, I'm coming to you next after this. OK, Sorcha, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we tell our children that compulsory smiling is a lesson well learned?
We have really high standards for discipline. That doesn't mean that anything's mean. In fact, it means everyone's happy because everybody knows what they're doing, and it means they get quickly to their lessons and they can enjoy life. And it allows the teachers the space to be able to bond with the children and develop relationships with the children. So, strict is good. It means you have happy children.
Catherine Birbal-Singh, the head teacher of the country's strictest school, or so she likes to claim, talking to The Times in 2019. Sorcha, what's happened this week?
Michaela School in North London already has the title of...
Yeah, it is an unofficial
UK's
title.
strictest
I think it's up for contention.
An unofficial title, yeah. But it's now got a competitor. The head teacher of John Fernley College in Leicestershire has issued a strict set of instructions to her young pupils. So she sent out a booklet with rules that include pupils must always smile. They're not allowed to pick up a pen or ruler without permission from the teacher. They have to make eye contact with the teacher if the teacher says hello, and their reply should always be upbeat.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like they're working in the Disney store rather than going to be educated. Why are these rules in place? What's the benefit?
Essentially, the claim is that these rules will prepare students for later life in the working world and are necessary to engender good behaviour and high achievement while they're in the classroom. OK,
well, let's dive into that a little bit. Is it necessary to establish working patterns when you're talking about 10-year-olds, Theo? Or, is there an argument that the more individualistic the children are allowed to be, the more that kind of free thinking is likely to benefit them in the workplace later?
Well, I'm always a bit nervous about, pontificating about things which obviously the teachers are the ones who sort of know about. But there is at least a pretty good argument that the no excuses culture, and I'm not saying that this doesn't always extend into the smiling thing, which is a pretty extreme version of it, but the, no talking in the corridors, total observation of, all the micro rules, that in areas, particularly where people might have chaotic home lives, that these are massively helpful. And, you look at schools like the Michaela School does have really great results. And so I think there's certainly an argument that they are, that they can be good.
What's it doing to children's mental health, though, Kate? I mean, it's all very well saying they have great results academically. I mean, this has been the argument for the last 20 years, hasn't it? Oh, our schools should be more like China. But we know that lots of people grow up in China hating their lives. So, I mean, what are you trying to aim for here? You've got a world where kids are being told, don't go to the toilet when you need to go to the toilet, smile if you're feeling unhappy.
It's really difficult. On the one hand, you do have studies that say that the stricter, more high discipline countries are also the highest performing countries academically. But then on the other, you have studies that find that, super strictness and micromanagement of classroom behaviour actually has the opposite effect and doesn't enhance learning at all. Personally, I think the idea of telling children to smile when they are potentially experiencing mental health issues is quite damaging. People should be able to express the emotion that they're feeling. Fitting a fake smile over your face doesn't really send a message to the child that their feelings are valid and that they're able to fully express themselves at school.
It's quite clear, though, isn't it, Sorcha, that the government's quite on board with this sort of thinking. Catherine Birbalsingh, who we heard from there in the clip, has been appointed to a government role.
Yeah, and in a way, this is just my personal opinion, but I do think this focus on super strict schools is kind of tapping into this culture war a little bit. Certain sections of society go back to this traditional view of the world.
Theo, you're the oldest one here. I don't know by how much. I don't know if they were still beating children when you were at school, were they? Did you ever get the stick?
I actually got beaten. I feel like it's an exciting sort of historical thing that happened in my life.
With what? What was the implement?
A slipper.
Right. And I mean,
very old school.
You are now grown up. You don't need to ask a teacher's opinion on whether it damaged you in any way or what you thought about it. Was that a good idea? I mean, because that's where a lot of this sort of discipline culture war chat takes you back to, isn't it? We need to go back to at least the threat of violence.
Yeah, I don't think it is a good idea. I mean, I don't raise my children with any sort of physical stuff, and I think it is easy to control children without that. And there are lots of disadvantages to doing it. But also, people find other unpleasant ways to raise their children without using physical violence. I don't think it's just, I think there are probably some people who do use spanking, and they're brilliant parents. So I think, I suppose as with the schools, it really depends on the culture a lot. I've read descriptions of London academies where they use these rules, which sound like brilliant schools run by incredibly passionate people. And also, I've heard accounts of different types of schools where they don't have any of that, and they want people to be able to express themselves and not to feel coerced. And that also sounds great. So it may sound like I'm sitting on the fence a bit here.
I mean, it's the whistling, Kate, that kind of disturbed me when I was reading the details. The teacher will whistle once for you to do something and twice for you to do something else, literally sort of treating the children like dogs.
Yeah, it does sound a bit of a military operation as opposed to somewhere where you want learning and creativity to flourish. And I think, as I'm a millennial, I was born in 92, and I find it quite shocking to think that corporal punishment was around for, I think it was as late as 1986 in state schools and even later in private schools.
Yeah, I remember hearing someone getting smacked in my school. It was in a school assembly. She dropped her knickers and she was taken out, which amused everybody. But then she was taken out into the hall and beaten by the headmistress. And I remember it still. I was 7, she was 5. Still in my head.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it stayed with you all this time really does make you think about those methods and the impact, the long-term impact that it would have had on people.
But some parents are obviously behind this, aren't they, Sorcha? And particularly, as Theo was hinting, parents where the kids are in deprived areas and they feel like actually if they're not given discipline at school, they're going to drift into a life of crime. This is an opportunity where they think they're given the kind of discipline you might have expected at a private school in a state school. And not every parent thinks this is abusive. A lot of parents are really behind this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, first thing to say is that there's no physical punishment involved in any of these. They're just very strict rules. And I think what's interesting about what the head of Michaela School said is that she said these rules mimicked behaviour expected in middle-class families, such as sitting up at the dinner table.
Yeah.
And I think that's a slightly suspect statement to make. I think it's kind of leaning into negative stereotypes about working class people, ethnic minority families. Working class families are perfectly capable of bringing up well-behaved children and don't necessarily need the school to kind of step in and say, we're going to sort your children out for you. And I think it's also interesting that, these are techniques that were pioneered in the US, and increasingly the schools that pioneered these slant techniques are actually moving away from them.
Yeah, SLANT. That's an acronym, isn't it? Do you have to hand what it stands for?
Yes. Sit up, listen, ask and answer questions, nod and track the teacher with their eyes. So yeah, these US schools are actually moving away from using these techniques, specifically in light of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. And they essentially say that these are disciplinary processes which actually harm children from Black, Latinx and working class communities. They don't think these are the right approaches anymore. So I think it's interesting that as they're kind of dying down in the US, it's having a bit of a resurgence here. And I wonder if eventually we'll come to the same conclusion.
Obviously, I don't think they sound particularly attractive, a lot of these things, and they sound coercive, they sound sort of slightly fascistic. But I think you've got to look that since discipline has been taken very seriously, particularly in the big cities in Britain, attainment has gone up a lot. You've got to acknowledge that this. I mean, maybe it's not because of that, maybe it's because of other things. But I think for those who are behind this sort of thing, there is a clear argument that it is doing something, and I can see that. If you're teaching in a school, you don't want to spend your whole time managing, whether someone's angry about something. You want to be teaching, and what they say is that these rules, though they sound coercive, actually allow children to express themselves. They allow them to feel safe. They allow them to feel organised. And then they get to do what they're there to do, which is to think about things and to talk and to listen.
Despite that, I can hear your dog barking in the background, Theo, so you're obviously a terrible disciplinarian.
I am very, very bad at training my dogs. That has to be said.
New rules for next week, though. No talking, no laughing, no smart aleck remarks. Kate, Theo and Sorcha, thank you for your time today. You are dismissed upon this whistle. Remember, you can follow this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer, Lauren Armstrong-Carter at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.